I always slightly struggle with starting off and thinking about what I'm talking about, because I'm not very comfortable with the language of social media. I'm not a big fan of the phrase social media for a number of reasons. The main one being that it's become a thing, that social media is something that people feel pressured to do, trying to keep up with others who are doing it, or buying technologies that cost nowadays lots of money in order to do it. And I'm also aware of the fact that the word social has repercussions in business. You know, people are still quite jumpy about the word social and being sociable in the workplace. I'll talk about that more later. And I think the word media has caused problems as well. Somebody the other day there referred to it as the social media, as if it was the media, and talked about channels, and clearly had just transplanted one lot of thinking onto the new social media. And it's also tended to mean that it's largely been taken over by marketing people, and agencies supporting the marketing side of businesses, and frankly taking us away from the potential that I think it really has. So rather than referring to the social media bubble, as it were, I think what we're actually talking about is just the web, and the web becoming more and more, or the internet becoming more and more part of our lives, including our work lives. And so what I'm going to talk about is the consequences of that, for us as people, but also for us as organisations. One of the reasons I'm jumpy about language is that I used to be called the Director of Knowledge Management at the BBC. And somebody once said, if you can't say your job title without wincing, you should change your job. The whole knowledge management thing was jargon-ridden, basically. And the whole language of extracting knowledge or capturing knowledge, you know, which a friend of mine said sounds like running around with a butterfly net trying to get a hold of the stuff. And then you get people who talked about harvesting knowledge, which sounds like some kind of cerebral milking machine that sucks the good stuff out of staff's heads and then leaves empty husks at the back door. And people wondered why nobody really got into knowledge management. I then was appointed as Director of Knowledge Management, must be 12 years ago now. And I think when I was given the job, I was expected to go out and buy knowledge repositories, you know, big document records systems. But I took a different view, because even in those days, this is a long time ago, PwC referred to their knowledge repositories as knowledge coffins, where they said knowledge goes to die. And I felt that what I really wanted to do was help people in my big, as Annalise says, big bureaucratic organisation, big bureaucratic corporation, we used to say was what BBC stood for, to connect with each other, because we'd sort of lost the ability to do that. We'd been professionalised by John Burt. We'd adopted a management culture that had broken a lot of the networks that used to be how we got things done. And I saw in the web and, you know, blogging, bulletin boards, forums and wikis, the potential to rebuild some of that. So I was in a technology demonstration unit at the time, so I had my own servers. I had a wonderful guy, John, who I would throw daft ideas over my shoulder, and the next thing I knew, he'd got off and found some open source tools or built something, and we were beginning to make something. I just started to play on our intranet. I was lucky that I knew most of the guys who could sack me. I was a senior manager, was given quite a lot of leeway in terms of what I was able to do without asking for permission. But nonetheless, I used to have to present strategy papers to John Burt, the Director General at the time, of this nirvana that I was going to create for the organisation, which just was his worst nightmare. I just bounced off the guy because it was not the world that he saw. It wasn't the world that he'd been successful in. It was very antithetical to that. And I still see this happening 12 years later, where people are sort of trying to sell or pitch this whole social thing to people for whom it's still really alien and still intimidating. So I took the view that I was better to ask for forgiveness than permission, and just started to do stuff. So the first thing we did was put in a bulletin board, a very basic forum, cost £240 for the software, Began to use it literally amongst my team in an office, sharing an office together. We would just start asking each other questions and answering them using this tool, just to start to get some activity going. And then we would show it to other people who we knew were up for it, were already doing this on the web, and they began to use it. And only then did we begin to show it to other people. So right from the word go, the tool grew virally. We didn't have any mandate, we didn't have a comms initiative, we didn't involve the comms team at all at that point. And it grew, and people found value in it. And largely through asking and answering questions. How do I do this? Where do I find this? Has somebody done this before? We got up to about 6,000 users over the first year or so. And then people got a bit jumpy who weren't used to it, that it was messy. They were concerned that it was all straggly, just all these unstructured conversations, which I was loving, because that's how this stuff works. And I'll come back to later why I think people can actually navigate mess more readily than we assume. But I lost a couple of battles, and we ended up having to tidy it up and structure it and brand it and have colours that related to the different parts of the BBC. And there are some of those early users who still have never forgiven me for losing that battle, because we turned what was a very lively, high sense of ownership network into a more sterile corporate kind of space, and we regretted that. There's other questions that people would ask, for instance, as well. I mean, back to what Annalie was saying, about the social aspects or the consequences of these tools. Not always foreseen. A very trivial thing. Somebody asked, what can we claim for using our own car for business purposes? And the first thing that happened was half a dozen different answers came back to the question. And you can imagine some HR managers or whatever getting quite jumpy about the fact that this tool was spreading misinformation. But when you think about it, the misinformation existed before the question was asked. The tool didn't spread misinformation. It surfaced the fact that people had different ideas of what was the right answer. Then what happened was somebody pointed to the official document on policy on expenses, which was in itself really useful, because most of us wouldn't have known the document existed, would have struggled to find it given how difficult internal corporate search is. We all got to know that's the rule. But then what happened was 3 or 4 people came back and said, well, we know that's the official rule, but our part of the business does it differently for these good reasons. And then ensued this really interesting debate about the reasons why the rule didn't work everywhere. And in fact, HR were very good eventually at coming in and taking part in those conversations. So it was just a very early and interesting example of where there is something disruptive about having these kind of networks. Stuff surfaces. One person over here can be complaining about one thing where somebody over here thinks it's inevitable, and they begin to see that they're two ends of a chain and they start to talk to each other. Equally, and this is quite intimidating for managers, that once they begin to start playing in the space, expectations of them change. Their behaviours have to begin to change. There's something quite, sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. There's something about once you start doing stuff on a platform that in our case eventually became used by 25,000 people, you can't get away with things that you can get away with in a closed office. So some of the attitudes and the assumptions that people had about status or authority or whatever else began to look silly when they started trying to act that way on this platform. Conversely, we had a particular guy who was in Radio Cumbria, which is basically 2 engineers and a sheep in the middle of nowhere. And until this platform had no real visibility within the organisation, but this guy kept answering really good questions with really good answers and being really helpful to lots of people. So his status, his presence began to increase, and his credibility and his leverage began to increase. Equally, we had people sitting in offices in London who had fancy job titles and big salaries who didn't answer questions. And you began to think, well, do you not know the answer, or are you just not willing to take part? So it began to open up lots of cans of worms, basically. Is this microphone coming and going a little bit?
It sort of comes and goes a bit.
We then put in a blogging engine, which was difficult because blogging in a corporate setting, I'll come back to why later, but is a challenge. Really opening up simply thinking in front of the whole organisation is a non-trivial ask of people. But I was mentioning earlier that one of the groups who took to it earliest was our IT security strategy team. Who prior to us putting it in had basically been the guys who said no to anything. Just anything remotely dangerous or risky they were on top of. But they began to blog about the conferences they were going to, the policies they had to conform to, the legislation they had to meet. And because they blogged so well, they began to get an audience, and that audience grew. And increasingly, there was this big network of people who were responsive and who were willing to give these guys an ear and beginning to be sympathetic to their issues and their challenges, which had never happened before. And then the last thing we put in were the wikis. And this is a particular example I'm showing you is quite interesting because what we decided was that we needed some kind of, I decided I needed some kind of policy from the BBC as to what I could or couldn't write about as a blogger. Because I was beginning to get more of an audience outside, what were the limits as to what I could say. So what we did was we approached the 400 or so people in the organisation who we knew had personal blogs and said, we're going to set up these rules, what do you think we should include? And on the basis of those responses, we put a draft document in our wiki and sent them all a link to that document and asked them to come in and improve it. So Wikipedia style, they came in, edited, took stuff out, added stuff in. Really busy 2 weeks of activity. It gradually slowed down, and we realised that we had our policy. With a couple of changes from legal, that still forms the core of what now, 12 years later, is the BBC's social media policy. Not a single meeting took place to achieve that. When it was launched, people just lined up behind it because they'd been part of writing it. And it was just a really early example of what's possible once you have a community that trusts each other and these type of platforms to enable them. What I became aware of, though, was that what we were seeing was a different way of relating to each other, working with each other. And this sentence is actually from a book called The Clue Train Manifesto, which I'm sure some of you have read or heard of, written by some guys 10 years ago on what they thought were the most interesting aspects of the web. And this sentence always struck me as capturing what I was trying to do in my organisation, enabling globally distributed, near-instant, person-to-person conversations. And in fact, at one point I was asked by my boss to do one of these one-line descriptions of what your job was. And I said, increasing the frequency and the quality of the conversations that get your job done. Which I was quite proud of. I thought it was quite pithy, quite work-like. And I was told I couldn't use the word conversation because it wasn't business-like enough. However, just to look at the different elements of that, the globally distributed aspect. Clearly with the internet we can connect with people all around the world, we can connect with bloggers in Iran or China or whatever. But equally within an organisation you can break down all sorts of silos and boundaries that make it really hard sometimes to connect with people in your own organisation. The near instant aspect, I think, is what challenges a lot of people who are in charge of communication, because the word spreads around these networks faster than they can cope with. And this is challenging broadcasters all the time. The news teams are turning up to events and the story's already being spread by the participants in the event. And so they're playing catch up all the time. Same was true in an internal environment. We had an internal comms team who did all staff emails about significant things in the organisation. But once our network got going, we all knew within minutes what had happened, and we were talking with people who were actually involved in the situation. And then this all-staff email would come out in sort of management speak and just looked bizarre because it just didn't tally with what we were actually talking about. So they eventually stopped. But hopefully the reassuring thing and the important thing is that it is about person-to-person relationships. It's about building networks of relationships. And people, I think, still, obviously more and more folks are using Facebook and beginning to see the potential of this. But the degree of trust that you can build using these platforms, I think, is little understood. I said obviously I've been blogging for 12 years. There are people who I have known for those 12 years who I know better than people I've worked with for the same length of time. I know better than neighbours I've lived next to for nearly as long. My wife would argue no better than I know her. But it's partly because we exchange stuff on blogging that you don't tend to in normal conversation. You don't walk into an office and start philosophizing on a Monday morning. It's not normal. But on blogging, there's something about it and about the networks that we form that allows us to build some really trusted relationships. Just to quickly go over the different platforms, and I know most of you will now be familiar with these, but the first thing to say is I'm showing them on my mobile phone, because that's how most of us nowadays access these platforms. But I was doing a workshop for an insurance company in the UK the other day there, who were talking about having banned Facebook at work. And I rather arrogantly said, well, you're obviously not banning anything unless you take people's phones from them. And they said, oh, we do.
Oh.
So my reaction was, well, they're working for you then. But just bizarre that they can be sufficiently draconian to take the phones off people to prevent them from continuing to use these networks. I won't name the insurance company. But, the blog's there because it's still, I think, the most powerful of these tools. There's something about that 3 or 4 paragraph optimal format that's enough to get some neat, grounded idea. It's enough to have some real influence. And also, unlike all the other tools, my blog is my blog. The domain name points to that, will always point to that. So it's my kind of gravitational centre as I play in all these other platforms. And particularly in the context of work, I think blogging is the most powerful tool. My fantasy is an organisation where everybody blogs for a number of reasons. Because having a blog makes you notice more. You become more aware of the things that are happening around you. You think, well, I blog about this. What am I going to say about this? What will other people think about what I say about this? In fact, that's one of the reasons my blog is called The Obvious. Because it was me overcoming my reticence about stating the obvious. Because like most of us, I pre-filter. I think, well, who am I to say this? People will laugh if I say this. People will disagree with me if I say this. And I still have that nervousness 12 years later when I press save on a blog post as to what the consequences are going to be. Second tool, obviously, is Facebook, which, like it or not, with 1 billion users, is how most people are experiencing this kind of connected world. And it's showing patterns. It's showing networks and things that were otherwise invisible. And the number of times that people these days say, oh, they could just have Facebook for the workplace. And in fact, there's an Australian chap I quoted the other day that wrote an article comparing Facebook with your average IT department. And the amount of functionality, the numbers of users, the fact that I think it's 1 member of staff for every 1 million users that Facebook has. He was making an unkind comparison with, your average IT department. And of course, there is that naive expectation that if you just gave everybody Facebook, all of this stuff would automatically start to happen, which isn't, of course, true. But people have to try and manage those expectations. And then the last one there is Twitter, which, like most of you, I guess, when I saw it the first time, I thought, I need this like a hole in the head. More people's inane twaddle about what they had for breakfast. And of course, when you first see Twitter, that's kind of what you get, the undifferentiated screed of stuff. But I now wouldn't do without Twitter, for a couple of reasons. One, paradoxically, given that concern, that it filters the web for me. It means that I get better stuff faster. And I have people who are filtering out all the crap, or as much of the crap as they can on the internet. And the way that happens is by narrowing down to a very small group of people that I actually follow. So just a sense of the sort of proportions. And there's about 7,500 people follow me on Twitter. I'm not going to follow 7,500 people back. I do follow about 3,000 of them back because I want them to be able to direct message me. And Twitter won't like it unless you're being followed. But I only pay attention to 100 people because I can only cope with 100 people's worth of stuff. And I manage those 100 people. If they're adding more noise than signal, I'll take them out. If I feel I'm getting stuck in an echo chamber, I will put people in who are slightly different or stretch me in a certain way or whatever. So I take responsibility for that network. The other benefit of Twitter is as a resource. And an example of this was I was doing a webinar with a university in the States where there was a couple of 100 people sitting in a lecture hall waiting to watch me on the screen. And for some reason the software wasn't seeing the camera on my laptop. So I was seriously looking at the prospect of blank screens. I only had minutes to go, 3 or 4 minutes to go. And I tried rushing, looking through the help files, trying to find what settings to change. I tried to get hold of somebody in a help desk, which was equally useless. Pushed the question into Twitter, and within 10 seconds I got 4 answers come back, telling me what settings to change. Now I can't think of another way that I could have achieved that as quickly. And the reason it happened was the principle of reciprocity. The fact that there were enough people out there who were well enough disposed towards me because I had added sufficient value to them over the time that they followed me, that they were willing to help. And also just the numbers thing, just the fact that if you have 7,500 people there's more chance of 4 of them knowing how to change the settings. So that then becomes a real resource. Part of the reason they trust me, and I was talking earlier about trying to help corporations and individuals within corporations get involved in this stuff, was that I have, over time, been prepared to talk about what I've had for breakfast. You know, I had a book published recently which I called Organisations Don't Tweet, People Do. And it was called that from a slightly grumpy tweet that I did when I got so frustrated when corporations started invading what I saw as a personal network space with 140-character press releases. And they still do it to this day. Whereas allowing yourself to actually within an office, do that kind of personal stroking. What did you do at the weekend? What did you have for coffee? You know, it's just that sort of human thing of allowing each other to connect. And actually, a brief example, I mean, and it has got consequences that are business consequences. I'm working with BP at the moment, and the Director of Communications there, David Bickerton, follows me on Facebook. And my dentist had given me some samples of toothpaste, one of which had the tagline, Pro Expert. So I wrote on Facebook how honoured I was to have got above the ranks of amateur in cleaning my teeth. David found this funny enough to like it, but was letting me know that he was awake, he was at his computer, and he was well disposed towards me. And I needed to get an answer from him about something, so I emailed him and got an immediate response back. So, you know, and again, this is sort of underlying the feeling that we've made business life so sterile and so professional that we've risked losing those kind of personal connections, which actually rely on a sort of mundanity. And a friend of mine talks about Twitter as being the intensity of the mundane, and I think it's a really nice way of looking at it. Again, we've been so used to commercial and professional communication being special and high profile and glamorous. I was doing some work for Land Rover recently and being shown around the factory by the guys who work there, who were really, really into their jobs, really into their product, really enthusiastic and well informed. And I said, you guys should so be blogging. And they said, well, we want to, but marketing won't let us. Because they want to hold on to this aspirational, glossy brochure type sheen that the cars have. A lot of what's driving this is just noticing stuff. You know, the Facebook like, it's people going, oh, that's interesting. And then other people reacting to that. So the skill of a good blogger, for instance, is knowing what's interesting. It's being more observant of what's interesting. And if you write a good blog post, other people then go, oh, that is interesting. And either amplify that, or react to it, disagree with it, add to it in some way. It's like lobbing pebbles into a pond. And you get better at lobbing bigger pebbles and knowing which pond to lob them into. So, I mean, in terms of the different platforms, it's like an ecology of different tools which have different audiences, different reactions, different networks in them. And you get better at knowing which one to press buttons to get the different reactions. A lot of it's about pointing. You know, I think a lot of these tools are just teaching us how to use the hyperlink to point at things. To say, that's the person that you should talk to, or this is what we did last time, or this is the official document you should read to find out the policy on claiming for your own car. And as I say, the like button and the plus button in Google are sort of slight corruptions of this, but they work on the same sort of principle. And then things like RSS, which, you know, comes and goes in terms of its visibility and popularity, but it's partly what drove the growth of these tools, because it allows you to subscribe to other sources of information. So things like Paperly rest on top of RSS, podcasting relies on RSS. It's a syndication platform or code that allows you to subscribe to different sources of information. And then hashtags. It's fascinating really that when Twitter first started, it was literally just 140 characters. There wasn't even the @ sign. And it was users who began to develop that convention. We would just put @ in front of everything that would, you know, for people's names. And then Chris Messina one day said, why don't we have a tagging system where we can say that this tweet is about a particular topic, and why don't we use the pound sign, the hash sign, to indicate that it's a tag? And look where we are now. You know, I spoke to Chris the other day there, and that was 6 years ago that he had invented it. I said, did you ever think that it would be on hoardings on the side of motorways or on adverts on the telly or Hollywood films that have hashtags? Utterly bizarre. But interestingly powerful that users, in an ephemeral, unmanaged way, are conferring meaning through hashtags sufficiently. That companies are now paying loads of money to game hashtags, to become the trending hashtags on Twitter. Really interesting how that self-driven ecology has gained so much power. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of both the technology, but also the organisational consequences of it, is sort of deindustrialisation. You know, we've professionalised communication to a ridiculous degree, where only your comms department are allowed to speak. We've ridiculously professionalised dealing with people so that only the HR managers are meant to be doing anything in terms of people. And we've kind of lost the ability to think for ourselves in a lot of businesses. There's a lot of, and I know, as you say, I was 21 years in the BBC altogether. And that almost willing infantilisation that goes on, the sort of things that we give up and wait for somebody else to decide, or allow somebody else to speak for us, has to be very different once you have these platforms. And in the early days of blogging, we talked about finding our voice, about just finding the things that you're comfortable or confident to talk about, and finding a way to do it in your own words and in your own language. And going back to the words that I spoke about earlier at the beginning, so much of our business language is sanitized. It's got the energy taken out of it. It requires us to think. And I was working with a consulting firm the other day there whose aspiration was to be thought leaders. And I said, how can you be thought leaders when nobody knows what you think? Because again, they're not really expressing ideas, they're expressing sound bites. And as individuals, if you're going to start to have traction with these networks, you have to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you're going to say about it. David Weinberger, one of the guys who wrote Clue Train, back in the early days of blogging, talked about writing ourselves into existence. And I think this is one of the reasons, and something I try to sell to senior executives to get involved in this, just the almost therapeutic activity of having somewhere to write once in a while about what you're doing, having a reason to stop for 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes a week, 5 minutes a month, and think, what was that all about? Why did I do the things I did? What am I going to write about it? And once you do that over time and you get feedback and you get reflections back from other people, you then start to have choices about, do I change? Do I continue to think what I think? Am I going to become modified by the things that I'm hearing back, or am I just going to stick to what I think? And if you do this over time, you leave a trace. That was one of the aspirations of knowledge management, was extracting all this knowledge so that when people left, knowledge retention was about keeping knowledge when people left the organisation. And I ultimately was made redundant from the BBC in sort of mutual agreement. A month before I left, I was asked to take part in a senior level meeting about how to prevent knowledge leaving the organisation. You couldn't make it up, really. And I said, unlike most people who are leaving, I have left a trace. All the blog posts, all the forum posts, all the wiki contributions are still there, if anybody chooses to go and look at them. You also get people worried, as I said earlier, about the messiness. And I, watching all these networks we had growing, realised that what I was seeing was the equivalent of old villages that grow up haphazardly. Nobody predetermines the architectural style. Nobody says you have to have red roofs. But they sort of work as places, because we've got lots of well-worn paths, and you feel comfortable standing on street corners because they feel human-scale spaces. Most of our corporate systems are like new towns, with lots of straight roads and roundabouts, efficient on the face of it. This is actually Milton Keynes, a town in England, which is notorious because people get lost in Milton Keynes all the time. Even with a sat nav, I get lost every time because the sense or the layout I struggle to map to. So this is what I was saying earlier about some of the messiness and some of the networks and the paths through these spaces are actually more readily navigable. Something else we need to be aware of is that we've become so good at sanitizing, and so much effort has gone into tidying up. Management's focus is on tidying up and making things organized, is that we've really risked killing all the signal along with the noise. But we're ending up not saying an awful lot. And if you're going to get over that, you have to allow people to talk more rubbish. You know, everybody goes on about all the rubbish there is on the internet, and it's so counterintuitive to say, well, actually, if you want people to get engaged and really use these platforms to their full, you have to allow them to talk rubbish. You have to allow them to be sociable. You have to allow them to talk about what was on the television last night or what they had for lunch. Because if you don't, they won't spend time in here. If you just build corporate, sanitized, smart, tidy places, they will bugger off and spend their time on Facebook. And deploying the tools is different as well. You know, again, I watch people buying things like Jive and Tibber and Yammer and whatever else, and these big enterprise scale platforms take enterprise scale agreement and effort and money. So it's like your average IT deployment with lots and lots of people having to get involved, lots of consultants, lots of time. I still think these things happen better virally and tactically. A British academic referred to the idea as Trojan mice. Lots of little things that in themselves don't take a lot of money or a lot of effort, but gradually over time grow into something worthwhile. And another idea that we sort of clung to was this from the American Marines, which is keep moving, stay in touch, and head for the high ground. Don't over-strategize. Don't oversell. Have a rough idea of where you're heading. Do things, keep doing things, and keep talking about what you're doing. So deploy cheap tools. If they don't work, throw them away, try again. Be patient. And the challenge that a lot of organizations are facing, going back to the original premise that this is sort of a marketing thing and people are feeling pressure to do it, is lots of them are beginning to do social on the outside and trying to be 2.0, but they're not 1.0 inside. So the outside world hits the stoppers when it begins to connect with the inside world. So there'll be this lively conversation or something kicking off where you're being criticized on the web, and you have to wait a day and a half to get your blog post response certified by a team of people. The example of this was in the UK, where Vodafone had paid an agency to make them trendy, and they had a hashtag around what did you do today? And they then had a Twitter fall on their corporate homepage. At the same time, they were being criticised for not having paid their corporate taxes. So that hashtag got hijacked very quickly by people criticising Vodafone on their own front page in this scrolling Twitter form. And word got round Twitter really quickly, so we're all sitting watching this thing, this disaster happening, for 4.5 hours before somebody in Vodafone woke up and took it down. So I think that's an extreme example of where if your inside is not capable of going as fast and keeping up with the outside, you're going to get into trouble. People still struggle with the personal nature of it. And this is the nature, this is why I say organizations don't tweet, people do. At the point of writing something, it is a person who writes it. And this is where people like Virgin Airways are very good. Their support's done online on Twitter these days. And it's Joe at Virgin or Mary at Virgin. And when they change shifts, they'll say, I'm off, Mary's taking over, or whatever. They're not pretending that a corporation can be my friend in Facebook or Twitter. And lots of organizations trying to do this, I'm afraid it's a bit like watching your dad dancing at a disco. You're really proud of him for having a go, but you kind of wish he'd stop. I can say that as a dad who's got teenage kids. But also the inside is becoming the outside. I think the lines between us at work and us at home are becoming very blurred. And are you representing your company when you're at home, when you're on networks on Twitter or Facebook, when you've had a couple of glasses of red wine on a Friday night, or aren't you? Where does the obligation start and stop? I wrote a chapter in a book recently which I called Your Staff Are Your Best Advocates. If you can get over those hurdles and allow staff to talk about you and what you do and be enthusiastic about it, they become incredibly good at building your brand. If you can't, and you don't trust them to, arguably you've got problems beyond using social media. In fact, to quote Dave Weiner, the guy who invented RSS, he once said, if you don't want me to slag off your product on the internet, don't have a shit product. And I think that's the uncomfortable bottom line nature of this that some companies are squirming about. And we still have huge, going back to the Land Rover example, or you could argue BP and other big corporates spend lots of money on managing brands. But increasingly that management of the brand just makes them feel untrustworthy. It makes us sceptical, it makes us wary of them. Because we're beginning to build our own networks where we're deciding whether things are or aren't valuable through our own opinions. So the last story really just, I think, hopefully captures the essence of this. And this was a story about my own experience with a crumpler bag, which I believe are made in Australia. And I was annoyed by the length of this strap. It was too short for my long bag. It's got a very thick strap on the thing. So I undid it to lengthen it, and then couldn't work out how it had been laced. I couldn't relace the bloody thing. So I'm flapping my way around the world's airports, annoying other passengers with this for months. And then Crumpler UK started following me on Twitter for reasons better known to themselves. So when I noticed this, I said, seeing as you're there, could you tell me how to relace my bag strap? And whoever it was had a brave attempt in 140 characters, predictably failed miserably. And I said, sorry, I'm none the wiser. They said, okay, give me an hour. Then an hour later, they direct messaged me with a link to this Flickr page, which had a sequence of 6 photographs showing me how to relace my bag strap. So I'm well chuffed, happy chappy. Going around the world's audiences talking about this great experience that I had with this company. In fact, I still get good returns on my blog for searches for how to relace a crumpler bag strap. It's great. But I then, 6 months or so later, had a problem with the zip. So I went back looking for my mate, the crumpler. Got no response. So whether they'd been sacked for using Twitter at work, or more likely had moved on. The point was, I felt let down. I felt that some kind of relationship had been established, some kind of trust, very modest, had been established, that then got severed. So I think if you're going to get involved in this stuff, both internal with staff and external with customers, you kind of have to be in for the long game and stick with the relationships through thick and thin. Last sort of squishy slide, and again it's a David Weinberger quote. He once said that what makes the internet hang together isn't IP, it's love. It's the basic human desire to be connected with each other. This is why people liking what you've done on Facebook matters more than it should. It's why whether somebody responds to my blog posts matters more than it should. And it's why I think companies have got huge benefits to be gained from engaging with stuff in this way. Because work wants to be about passion and about caring about things, about caring about the products and making the world a better place. And as I say, I call me an aging hippie, but that's the aspiration I have for it, for us to become more passionate and connected and caring ourselves and how we conduct ourselves at work, but also the organisations we work for to be able to become more effective through us doing that. Thank you very much for listening. I noticed in Dimmock's that the book is on sale. So I was well chuffed at coming to the other side of the world and seeing a modest pile of it there. But anyway, as I say, thank you very much for listening.